What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the Earth and our universe is really his story.
A production of Youngstown Christian Television, a program where we seek to integrate what we find in the Bible and supplement it with what we find in history as well, and help us to understand both better, and to maybe even have a little more confidence in the biblical record along the way. At the very least, it gives us some background for understanding what we find in God's Word. The last time we were looking at the establishment of the Hebrew people coming into the land, or getting ready to look at them coming into the land. We looked at the history of the Hebrew people, beginning with Abraham coming out of Ur of the Chaldees, moving on into the time when the Hebrew people were in bondage in Egypt, where Moses was sent by Yahweh God to bring them out of Egypt in the Exodus, and then take them eventually into the Promised Land. Along the way, however, Moses takes his Israelite people back to where he encountered Yahweh in the burning bush, Mount Sinai. Now, if you watched our previous episode concerning Mount Sinai, this is probably 3 or 4 or 5 episodes ago, you know where that was located. If you're not sure about that, go back in the archives and watch that particular episode. But at Mount Sinai, where Yahweh had originally called Moses, he also established a theocratic government for Israel, so that the Israelites were given a government. This took the form of what is known today as a suzerainty vassal treaty. Now, this is a common rubric in the ancient Near East for the establishing of a ruling relationship between a conquering or stronger entity and its weaker vassal. This covenant was to bind the people to Yahweh as their king, and to bind the tribes to one another as co-vassals of the king. It was the creation of a theocratic state with all Israelites equal under God. In other words, God established with Israel a kind of treaty or covenant which was similar to what any king might establish with a people that he conquered, or the people over which he ruled. There would be things discussed on both sides, and so all those things would be worked out, and we're going to see how that occurs in this theocratic government. Theocratic meaning God rules. God is to be the king in this relationship. God is the ruler over Israel. The order of this treaty, this suzerainty vassal treaty, begins with a preamble which identifies the suzerain or great king, who is the author of the covenant and is giving it to his vassals. The emphasis in any treaty of this type is upon the majesty and power of the king. And we find this expressed in Exodus 20, 2a. He says, I am the Lord your God, or I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Yahweh, the great king, is the author of the covenant and is presenting it to his vassals. Yahweh your God. Next in order comes the historical prologue, which describes in detail the previous relations between the king and his vassal, including the deeds which the king has performed for the benefit of the vassal. This rehearsing of the benefits received has the effect of perpetual gratitude on behalf of the vassal toward the great king. A part of this formal declaration is the I-you form of address, where the king speaks directly to the vassal. This is found in Exodus 20, the second part of verse 2. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And in Exodus 19, the last part of verse 3 through 6, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. And that includes the I-you style that we find in the suzerain treaty. Subsequently come the stipulations, which state in detail the obligations imposed upon and accepted by the vassal. The first obligation or commandment is delineated in Exodus 20, verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. By implication, they also had to reject all foreign relations as well, for to make alliance with a foreign nation would be tantamount to a recognition of its gods. That's important for us to understand when we see later on kings of Israel and Judah making treaties with other nations. Under the monarchy, this first stipulation is repeatedly breached, and therefore the prophets consistently decry these unholy alliances. In the fourth commandment, which comes at the end of the heavenward section of commandments, the Sabbath sign may be equivalent to the suzerain's dynastic seal found in the midst of international treaty documents. Since the second commandment clearly forbids any representation of Yahweh, there can be no representation of Him on the seal. However, the sign of the covenant is the Sabbath. God stamped on Israel's history the sign of the Sabbath as His seal of ownership and authority. Did you get that? The Sabbath was the sign of God's seal of ownership and authority upon Israel. The last 6 commandments indicate all the vassals are equal and protected by the king. Any hostility against a co-vassal, in other words, another person in the covenant community, is hostility against the king himself, for it jeopardizes the interests of the king. In Israel, too, the vassals or tribes must appear regularly before the Lord. Exodus 23:17 says, 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord God. Following these sections comes the provision for deposit in the temple and periodic public reading. Among ancient Near Eastern countries, a copy of the treaty was to be deposited in the temples of each participant as a sign of the participation of the gods. If you remember back at the treaty following the Battle of Kadesh, we mentioned that the treaty was attended to by hundreds of gods and goddesses. The same thing is evident here in the suzerain treaties, as a copy of it is put in the temple of each god. Israel was to place the 2 tablets inside the Ark of the Covenant, because there's only one God in evidence here. Only one God who is a part of this, and He is also the suzerain. After this came the invocation of the gods as witnesses to the covenant in suzerain treaties, including not only the gods of the partakers, but also, quote, the mountains, rivers, springs, sea, heaven and earth, the winds, and the clouds. Now, obviously, in the case of Yahweh's covenant, there could be no invocation of other gods. He is the only God, or I should say the only true God, the only one involved in the covenant. However, when the covenant is renewed, in Deuteronomy 32, the heavens and earth are called as witnesses. Look what it says. Give ear, O heavens, and let me speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. And he goes on. So it's the heavens and the earth that is acting as a witness to the reestablishment or the renewal of this covenant between Yahweh and his people. Next came the curses and blessings formula. Excuse me. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had that up there. Deuteronomy 32 is there. Now give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. So next we come to the curses and blessings formula, where the gods are called to witness the oath invoked to execute curses or blessing according to the vassal's deserts. Thereafter came the formal oath by which the vassal pledged his allegiance. Afterward, a solemn ceremony accompanied the oath, and then a form for initiating the process against a rebellious vassal. Although there's no separate section of blessings and curses in the covenant given in Exodus, I believe that we can find just an enumeration in Deuteronomy 29, where the nation has been summoned to renew their covenant with Yahweh prior to entering the promised land. There, I believe, Yahweh does give this section of blessings and curses. I'm not going to go through that all, but you can look it up yourself and see if that is not the case. So that covers the idea of a theocracy and the use of the culture around to emphasize to the Israelite people that God is their suzerain, God is their king, and as the vassals of the king, they owe him certain things, they owe one another certain things, as indicated in the Ten Commandments. Let's move on now on to an examination of the promised land itself and the situation that we find at the conquest. This is during the late Bronze period. In the land of Canaan at this point is a province of Egypt organized in city-state system. The larger cities were ruled by a native king who paid tribute to Egypt. The cities were well fortified. Military power was enlarged by local princes with chariotry and foot soldiers, which would be made up of the common people. Now, from the years 1500 to 1300 BC, there was a significant decline in the Canaanite civilization. This was brought about by several things. One is the heavy taxation and the corrupt administration of Egypt from 1550 to 1220 BC. Secondly, there was the social organization. Because of the heavy taxation, there was no middle class. And with no middle class, that also worked against the development of crafts and guilds, and therefore against the progress of civilization. It is when you have a middle class that you are able for civilization to continue, to progress. That's why it's such a threat to any nation if the middle class is diminished. And that's largely done through either war or taxation. And I would say primarily through taxation. Think about that in terms of our present situation. A third evidence, at least, if not cause, of Canaanite decline, or the civilization declining in Canaan, is the debased level of Canaanite religion. It may be stated without exaggeration that the Canaanite religion was the most sexually perverted, morally depraved, and bloodthirsty of all ancient history. It was for this reason that God ordered Joshua to exterminate their very culture, citizens, and cities. I know many times people get upset over the Old Testament saying, oh, I can't worship a God who would order the extermination of all those people as the Hebrews moved into the Promised Land. You don't understand the situation. The situation was a religion which included human sacrifice sacred prostitution, eunuch priests, serpent priests, and a brutal mythology. Let's just look into a bit of that. The head god of the Canaanites was El. Now that's the same name that's used in the Hebrew Old Testament for our God sometimes. Sometimes he is simply called El. And so this is a common name between the two, but this is their head god. His wife was Asherah. You can see her pictured there. His son was Baal. And his daughter was Anat. El also married his 3 sisters, one of whom was Astarte. El had 70 children, the most famous one being Baal. El killed his brother and some of his own sons. He then cut off his daughter's head, castrated his father, castrated himself, and compelled his confederates to do the same. The sister of Baal was Anat. She became the vile and vicious goddess of passion, war, and violence. She fought Baal's enemies because Baal really couldn't do it himself. He called on his sister to stand up for him. The Baal epic of Ugarit depicts her as follows. With her might, she mowed down the dwellers of the cities. She struck down the people of the seacoasts. She destroyed the men of the east. She drove men into her temple and closed the doors so that no one could escape. She hurled chairs at the youths, tables at the warriors, footstools at the mighty men. She waded up to the knees, up to the neck in blood. Human heads lay at her feet. Human hands flew over her like locusts. She tied the heads of her victims as ornaments upon her back. Their hands she tied upon her belt. Her liver was swollen with laughing. Her heart was full of joy. When she was satisfied, she washed her hands in streams of human blood before turning again to other things. Anat was called the Holy One, but she was sadistic, a sex goddess, and a prostitute. Sound like a god to worship? The name Baal can be translated Lord and is the title given to the storm god Hadad. Since Baal brought rain, he was also credited with bringing the annual crops which were dependent on the rain. In the Ugaritic myths, Baal was portrayed as a mighty, lustful, and ambitious deity, but also as a god with decidedly more muscles than brains. His worshippers clearly enjoyed a good story about Baal charging into a situation through sheer bravado, only to discover too late that it was really a dumb thing to do. Baal relied primarily on his sister Anat to rescue him from these difficulties of his own making, though others, such as Kothar and Hassus, who was a skilled artisan deity, Shapsu, the sun goddess, Asherah, and El, who were rulers of the pantheon, helped him as well. These were not just simple gods. These were awful, awful gods who perpetrated a disgustingly immoral and perverted religion upon the people of Canaan. Is it any wonder that Yahweh did not want that kind of system perpetuated among his own people? And the only way to prevent that was to completely eliminate them. Even at that, we find Baal worship coming into Israel later on, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. Let's consider now the invasion of the land of Canaan and the justification of destruction, or the theology of conquest. The real purpose was the preservation of the revelation given to Israel. We find that in Psalm 106, 34 to 39. God said that he needed to preserve his revelation, His law, what he had revealed about himself that had been given to the nation of Israel, it needed to be preserved not only for their benefit, but for the benefit of those who would come after them. It was important that they be kept from all these other influences that would cause them to neglect and forget what God had said. Not only was it for their own good that Canaan was wiped out, but also for the good of the nations. Because as I said, the religion of the Canaanites was the most debased in history. We should also understand that holy war was not unique to Israel. The procedure of any nation going to battle for their God followed a similar procedure. And that was, first you consult God before going to war. Then you blow trumpets and raise a war cry. The men are to submit to certain restrictions. The leader must be somebody who's charismatic, who gets their power from God. But the initiative is wholly from God. The number of soldiers on your side is insignificant because your God is behind you. And then there's the climax, or the terror, mahuma it's called in Hebrew. The panic, the confusion. God is seen then as the sole agent, therefore faith is crucial because your faith is in Him. And then the spoil was given to what's called the ban, or harem. It's dedicated to total destruction. And we'll see this happening a little bit later as the children of Israel move into the promised land. So the procedure of their advance was not unique to them. God used the culture around them to give them a framework for entering the land and conquering it on His behalf. Now, let's consider what were the military advantages of the Canaanites. Well, they had experienced armies with advanced weapons. Israel was quite unskilled in the use and manufacture of implements of war. They had at their disposal nothing but the most primitive weapons. They had bows, javelins, swords, knives, to say nothing of horse-drawn chariots, which the Canaanites possessed in vast numbers. They had chariots. Tutmosis III captured 924 of them at the Battle of Megiddo. They had fortified cities. There were turreted fortresses built of cyclops walls, which were to the children of Israel an unaccustomed and menacing sight. In the land of Canaan, in the land of Goshen, where they had lived in Egypt, which for many generations, there was only one fortified town, the town of Ramses. So from all their lives, or their parents' lives, as these are the descendants of that first generation, and all that they had seen, they had never come across walled cities like this before. And in Canaan, the country was plastered with them. Numerous strong points stared down from hilltops and mountain peaks, which made them look even more powerful and terrifying. And then also, the Canaanite people were accustomed to forming alliances. There were more than 100 cities that were allied against Tutmosis III. And so it really seems like a formidable task to come into the land of Canaan against such odds. But let's look at what occurred. Here are the boundaries of the promised land. And the basic campaign strategy is given to us here as Joshua proceeded. First of all, of course, they had to cross the Jordan River, and we won't go into the details there. It's a reenactment of the crossing of the Red Sea. And I would say it's not necessary to find naturalistic explanations for the miracles of Scripture. I don't care if you can explain how a miracle happened or not, it's still a miracle. And so God sometimes uses natural events to create what He wants, and sometimes He just does it without that. But it is possible that Yahweh may have used natural phenomena in the case of crossing the Jordan River, because when the nation of Israel approached it, it was a time of spring harvest when the river was at its peak due to the melting of snow on Mount Hermon. A damming of the river at the ford near the city of Adam would result in the drying up of the river to its south. This kind of damming has taken place at various points of the river over the centuries as the result of earthquakes, the last of which occurred in 1927. As a result of a severe quake, the riverbanks caved in, tons of soil crashed down into the riverbed from the low hills that follow the Jordan's winding course, one author has said. He continues, the flow of water was completely stopped for 21 hours. In 1924, the same thing happened. In 1906, the Jordan became so choked up with debris as a result of an earthquake that the riverbed on the lower reaches near Jericho was completely dry for 24 hours. Arab records mention a similar occurrence in 1267. So, for either natural causes that God engineered or God simply caused the river to stop, either way, the Hebrew people crossed over on dry land and, of course, erected the monuments that you can read about there in the book of Joshua. Now, from there, if they crossed the river, the basic campaign strategy is to move centrally through the land of Canaan, which means that they come first to the city of Jericho. Jericho was probably named after the Semitic moon god Yera, because in Hebrew it's not Jericho but Jericho, and was the largest fortified city in the ancient Near East at the time. So they're starting off with a bang. They're starting off with the biggest, most well-defended city, not only in that area, but in the larger area of the ancient Near East. And I'm sure you all have heard about the event of Joshua and leading the children of Israel to march around the city 7 times and in silence. Can you imagine keeping that many people silent for that long to march around the city? And imagine the epithets that were hurled at them from the city walls because they certainly felt that there was no way they could be conquered. And yet Joshua followed God's orders and marched around the city 7 times. And then on the 7th day, marched around 7 times, then blew the trumpets. And as the song said, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Did that really happen? I don't know. That seems pretty outlandish. You know what? It's going to seem even more outlandish next time when we see how those walls were constructed. But we're also going to look at evidence that demonstrates that the walls of Jericho did fall down for Joshua and his people. So we've looked at the Exodus from Egypt and how Moses led the children of Israel from Egypt, out of Egypt into the land of Moab, present-day Arabia, to Mount Sinai. There they received the law. The theocracy was established where God is the suzerain in this suzerain treaty, and the people of Israel are his vassals and co-vassals with one another. And if you read the text in Scripture, you find how they moved toward the promised land and did not believe God that they could enter in, but believed 10 of the spies who said, no, it's too much, we can't do it. And 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, said, God has given it to us, we can go. And how they wandered for 40 years because of that unbelief, and now have finally come back to this land again, have crossed the river Jordan, and now are confronted with the largest city, not only that they had ever seen, but probably anybody for thousands of miles had ever seen. Next time on Discovering His Story.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.